Welcome to JPod. This is a podcast on journalists and journalism. My name is Krishna and it's great to have you here. When WhatsApp becomes the chief source of information, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that India was a mere 17 years old as a free nation when China invaded in 1962. An impressionable teenager in a manner of speaking. On the other hand, when China intruded into Ladakh this year, seizing land and strangling soldiers, independent India was a full-grown adult, a real senior citizen if you will, all of 73 years old. But the manner in which India and Indians have reacted and responded to the Chinese incursions 58 years apart provides a grim commentary on the manner in which Indian democracy has matured. In 1962, the man at the helm of affairs was a learned liberal. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was in his third term and at 73, not quite in the pink of health. When the news of the Chinese invasion broke, the opposition parties pushed the government to advance the parliament session so that the issue could be discussed threadbare. The government listened, and a united response was formulated even if it ended up in a military debacle. Within the ruling Congress and in the opposition benches, there were discordant noises at the manner in which the issue was being handled by Defence Minister V.K. Krishna Menon. The defence chiefs of the time had the spine to act independently. The press went hammer and tongs at Nehru and Menon. Nehru actually made public all his correspondence with the Chinese to clear the air, but Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai was history. Contrast that to 2020 when a so-called strongman is in charge. Narendra Modi is 70 years old and in his second term. In the 3 months since the Chinese were spotted in the heights of Ladakh, the BJP-led NDA government has shown how lightly it treats Bharat Mata. On June 2nd, Defence Minister Rajnath Singh admitted that the Chinese had come into India in large numbers. But even after 20 Indian soldiers were killed on June 15th, the Prime Minister insisted that no one had intruded into Indian territory and there were no intruders on Indian soil. Yet, the two countries are in mutual disengagement as we speak. As opposed to 1962, Parliament has not met, coronavirus providing a handy excuse to short-circuit democracy. The decision-making processes have been opaque. The army is virtually run out of the Prime Minister's office by a national security advisor. The government spin masters send reporters notes intended not to send a message to the Chinese but at driving divisions within the opposition. And vast sections of the media have been mostly silent, if not pliant, painting a scenario far removed from the reality on the ground. The Modi regime thinks it can manage China by managing the headlines. My guest today on JPod possesses the most famous head in Indian politics in more ways than one, the former Union Minister and Congress MP Jairam Ramesh. In 2004, Jairam Ramesh introduced the portmanteau word Chindia, China plus India, in which he envisioned the two ancient civilizations leading the world together in the third millennium. Jairam, an engineer, an economist and an environmentalist, has just written a stellar biography of the brilliant V.K. Krishna Menon, who was Defence Minister in 1962 and is largely seen as the fall guy for the debacle. As the Chinese dig in and the news at the border gets grimmer, Jairam Ramesh provides much needed perspective on what the Modi government needs to do at this point. At a time when hawks in the government, in the army and in the media are crying for action, Jairam Ramesh believes the only way forward for the two nuclear powers is a negotiated settlement. But before we get into that conversation, here's a short message.
Social media, a place where you get news, views, arguments, fun stuff, vicious rants, all of which can drive you insane. It's all so confusing. Don't you wish there was a way to cut through all the noise? Say hello to the Net Paper, a first of its kind newsletter, a digital newspaper in your inbox, one that gets you the news the views, and the juice from Facebook and Twitter, TikTok and Instagram. If you wish to get the net paper in your email, do go to the netpaper.substack.com and hit subscribe. The Net Paper. All the juice that's fit to share.
Mr. Jairam Ramesh, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of JPod, the podcast on journalists and journalism. India last went to war with China in 1962, which was a full 58 years ago. But we in Indian media write and speak as if everybody is aware of almost everything that happened back then. Although just 6% of the population was even alive back then. First up, what are the 4 or 5 things Indians, young and old, should know about 1962 to understand what's happening in 2020?
Well, the most outstanding feature of 1962 was that it was Mao's India War. Contrary to the perception that was created later on by people like Neville Maxwell and brought into by Nehru's critics that this was Nehru's China War. Actually, scholarship has conclusively established the fact that it was because of domestic political reasons that had little to do with the border that Mao decided to invade India in October-November 1962. Roderick McFarcar and many other scholars have written about this. And this was Mao's India War. This was the time in which the USA and the USSR were locked, in conflict with each other over the Cuban Missile Crisis. Their attention was diverted, and Mao felt that this was the right time to strike, to cut India down to size, and also deal with his weakening, if not worsening, political situation domestically. So that's one very important lesson to take away from 1962. Secondly, the war was not inevitable. There had been talks going on, particularly from 1957-58 onwards. Chow En-lai came to Delhi in April of 1960. Krishna Menon met Cheney in July of 1962. So it was not, there was talk of having a negotiated settlement, but I'm afraid, Krishna Menon was in a minority of one in the Indian system. Nobody in India at that point of time wanted a negotiated settlement. Nehru's cabinet itself was deeply divided. Nehru was not the same Nehru of the early 50s. He was in the twilight of his life, biologically and politically. He was in the evening of his life. And Parliament and the media were completely opposed to any form of settlement. Krishna Menon was the only man arguing for a settlement on the border, a lease, a swap, a recognition of Chinese sovereignty in some areas, a recognition of Indian sovereignty in other areas. But all this, was hypothetical. And the biggest critic of the negotiated settlement approach was, of course, a very young member of parliament from UP belonging to the Bharatiya Jansangh, Sri Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And it's a supreme irony that as Prime Minister in 2003, Mr. Vajpayee signed an agreement which led to the appointment of special representatives on both sides, on the Chinese side and on the Indian side, to work out a negotiated settlement. And we've been trying to do this for the last 17 years. So the biggest critic, the bitterest critic of a negotiated settlement, Mr. Vajpayee, ultimately opened the doors for a negotiated settlement in 2003, something that Krishna Menon had been advocating all through the late 50s and early 60s. The third lesson, of course, is that Indian defense preparedness today is simply incomparable to that in 1962. Till 1962, the general dogma, the theory was that any investment in defense is an insult to the legacy of ahimsa, non-violence, Mahatma Gandhi. And in fact, I would hold Morarji Desai equally responsible as Krishna Menon for the lack of defense preparedness because he routinely denied any requests for defense modernization. Of course, India's foreign exchange position at that time was quite precarious after the foreign exchange crisis of 1958. But nevertheless, Morarji Desai's political stance was that India cannot afford defense expenditure. And this, of course, cost us heavily. But the same Morarji Desai, after the debacle of 62, changed his view, and India then started taking defense spending very seriously. We fought a war in 1965, we fought a war in 1971, we had clashes in Nathula in 1967, and of course, then we had Kargil in 1999. But the lesson of 1962 was that India cannot afford to neglect defense on sentimental or on emotional ground. The biggest critics of Mr. Nehru on defense was Acharya Kripalani. But all through the 50s, Acharya Kripalani was the one figure who was critical of India spending more on defense. But after the Chinese war, suddenly Mr. Kripalani started criticizing Nehru and Krishna Menon that they had neglected defense. So this was hypocrisy of the worst type. However, the lesson is that in the 2020 Indian Army, Indian military establishment is, of course, a vastly different one. And paradoxically, a lot of the credit for this must go to Krishna Menon. Because it was Krishna Menon who set up the DRDO in 1958. It was Krishna Menon who actually negotiated the MiG deal with the USSR. At that time, the Americans wanted to sell us fighter aircraft. The British wanted to sell us fighter aircraft. There were sections of the Air Force and the Army who wanted American aircraft. Some people wanted the British aircraft. But Krishna Menon was the one who said, we will choose only the aircraft that can be manufactured in India. Make in India in 1962. That's how the MiG deal, which was a watershed deal, was signed, and that was entirely because of Krishna Menon.
Yeah. Your most recent book, a stellar work of scholarship, is on V.K. Krishna Menon, who was the defense minister at the time. And you've studied the papers of the period and you're watching what's happening just now. How do the key figures of 1962 compare with the key figures of 2020 in India? I mean, the two prime ministers, Nehru and Modi, the two defense ministers, Krishna Menon and Rajnath Singh, the two army chiefs, General Timaya and General Narawane. How do they compare, you think?
Well, I've already mentioned to you, what happened to Mr. Vajpayee of the 50s. The critic of a negotiated settlement, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, in 2003, as Prime Minister, opened the doors for a negotiated settlement, which is the way the border has to be settled. This border cannot be settled through clashes, it cannot be settled through war, it has to be settled through a negotiated settlement. And that is something Mr. Vajpayee recognized in 2003, and subsequent governments have proceeded on that basis. After that, Dr. Manmohan Singh has proceeded on that basis, and Mr. Narendra Modi also has proceeded on that basis. Mr. Doval is the special representative on the Indian side, for talks on the negotiated settlement. There was the other big difference, Krishna Prasad, is the Chinese invaded India in two phases. They first invaded us on the 20th of October 1962. Then, after 8-9 days, there was a pause, and they again resumed the invasion on the 16th of November. Krishna Menon, of course, resigns as defense minister on the 7th of November 1962. Now, in between, somewhere on the 30th or the 1st of November, 30th of October or the 1st of November, a couple of MPs led by N.G. Gore, the great socialist leader, and Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, asked Mr. Nehru to convene Parliament immediately. Parliament was supposed to be convened, I think, around the 18th or the 19th of November 1962. So Nehru agrees, and Parliament is convened a week in advance It is actually convened on the 11th of November of 1962. And as the Chinese invade India a second time, Parliament is in session. Prime Minister is being attacked. The former defense minister is being attacked. People, the media is attacking. Cartoons are coming out in the press, Shankar and all these great cartoonists. And the prime minister is being lampooned. The Mr. Krishna Menon is being lampooned, and the war is going on. We are getting a drubbing, particularly in the eastern sector, in Nepal, which then became Arunachal Pradesh. But democracy was in full bloom.
Absolutely.
There was no attempt to stifle the media. There was no attempt at browbeating the media. There was no one saying criticism of the government is anti-national, don't raise questions. Galwan Valley was very much in the headlines at that time. People were raising the same questions that are being raised in 2020, but nobody's nationalist credentials, nobody's patriotism was being questioned. And I think Indian democracy, the full marks, I think the brightest moment for Indian democracy, I would say, was in October and November 1962 when it faced its unprecedented external threat. The government did nothing to stifle political opposition, called parliament, listened to the criticism, patiently responded to the criticism, and business went on.
Yeah.
And that's how democracies function. To me, that's the biggest difference between the situation in 2020 and in 1962.
Krishna Menon was seen to be caustic, acerbic, even mercurial. In your book, you write of B.K. Nehru calling him a closet communist, and Michael Straight of the Labour Party says he fought on every single issue. Yet, Krishna Menon was universally acknowledged to be an intellectual giant. In contrast, Rajnath Singh is seen as more gentle, more affable, and somewhat easygoing. Temperamentally, Jairam, what do you think? Is India in better hands because of a figure like Rajnath Singh, or does it not count because all the shots are being called from the PMO and by the National Security Advisor or other unseen hands?
I don't think we should personalize, the situation. It's not. I think Rajnath Singh is Rajnath Singh. He's a political figure in every sense of the term. Krishna
Absolutely.
Menon was not a political figure. He owed his entire political existence to Jawaharlal Nehru. He had no networks. He had had no political experience in India, unlike Rajnath Singh. So these are unfair comparisons. The times were different, the circumstances were different, the contexts were different. Krishna Menon, yeah, he was all that you said him. He was. He was caustic. He was acerbic. He was controversial. But he was also, as I said, he established the DRDO in 1958. If we are he talked about self-reliance. What Prime Minister is talking of Atmanirbharta today. Menon, of course, did not speak Hindi. He couldn't even speak Malayalam. So he talked about self-reliance. And it was Bharat Electronics, Hindustan Aircraft, so many. The tank factory in Avadi, all the prize jewels of defense production and defense research were Krishna Menon's contributions. But, of course, he also played favorites. I think he mollycoddled General Kaul too much. The appointment of General Kaul as Corps Commander, in NEFA was the single most disastrous decision that got taken. And because of his prickly personality, he was not able to carry Morarji Desai with him as finance minister, and investment in defense modernization suffered. He was also not a full-time defense minister. From 1957 onwards, when he became defense minister, for 3 months in a year, he used to be in New York, chairing India's delegation to the United Nations. So the times were different, the contexts were different. I think we learned the lessons from 1962. It was a very costly lesson to learn. Krishna Menon had to resign. Nehru was, Nehru's entire dream and vision of a relationship with China received a severe setback. And the reopening to China could happen only in 1988 when
Yeah.
Mr. Rajiv Gandhi went to Beijing in December of that year. So I don't think we should compare, individuals. I think the
Yeah.
system were
Yeah.
different. China was different at that time. India was different at that time. I think, but what is comparable is that the Chinese have deep internal problems today, and quite possible that this misadventure that they have embarked on the LAC to redefine the LAC, which they had agreed in 1993, has in large part been caused by diversionary tactics,
Yeah.
which Mao also had in 1962.
Exactly what I was coming to, because you called 1962 as Mao's India War. Could this possibly be Xi's India War? Is a question I was going to
Well,
ask you.
the phrase Mao's India War is not mine.
Right.
It was a phrase used by one
Of
of
course.
India's most distinguished ambassadors to China, C.V. Ranganathan,
Yeah. Yeah.
and yeah, Vinod Khanna in their book on India and China. It came out in the year 2000, and it's called Mao's India War. And this was their response to Neville Maxwell's, polemical India's China War.
Yeah.
If you read Neville Maxwell, China did nothing wrong and Nehru did nothing right. And
Yeah.
that's completely bogus argument. That's a completely bogus and highly polemical argument. And this has been debunked. It's been debunked by American scholars, by British scholars. It's been debunked by Indian scholars. Srinath Raghavan is one of the more recent ones to have debunked it. And clearly, in the biography that I have written on Krishna Menon, there is enough evidence to show how the Chinese, for example, in 1960, were deeply, deeply suspicious of India because of the flight of the Dalai Lama that had taken place the previous year. We tend to devalue the importance of the Dalai Lama's flight to India in 1959 as a contributory factor to
Yeah.
Chinese suspicions. But the fact is, Tibet weighed very heavily in the mind of Chow Enlai and the other Chinese leaders who came to India in April of 1960, which was the last opportunity for having some form of a negotiated settlement.
Yeah. Various theories have been advanced as to why China sees this moment to intrude into India. You mentioned a couple of causes, of course, but some have said that China has seized the COVID moment. Some others have said it's part of its expansionist program, etc. And just a couple of days ago, Rahul Gandhi said that China is trying to chip away at Modi's strongman image at this moment. you know, Given what we know so far, what is your understanding, Jairam, as to why China has done what it has done, which is so visible as unlike 1962? What differences do you find between the Chinese approaches then and now?
Well, one difference I should mention, Krishna Prasad, very important. Uh, Nehru went to China only once in 1954.
Yeah,
That's the only time that he met Mao.
yeah,
Chow Enlai and Nehru, and of course, met quite frequently. They met in 1956. They met in 54. They met in 56. They met in 58. They met in 1960. So they met 4 or 5 times. Krishna Menon met Chow Enlai in 1955 in Bandung. Then he met him in Beijing, and of course they meet in 1960. But no two Indian and Chinese leaders have had the type of intensive contact and prolonged contact as Mr. Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping.
correct.
No two prime ministers, no two heads of state, sorry, Xi Jinping is not a prime minister. No two top Indian and Chinese leaders have spent as much time, and geographically also it has been spread. It's been Ahmedabad, Delhi, Wuhan, Mahabalipuram,
Mahabalipuram.
all sorts of places. So there has never been the type of what I would call intensive and
Yes.
extensive contact between two Indian and Chinese leaders, as between Mr. Modi and Mr. Xi Jinping. If you can accuse Mr. Nehru of being taken in by the Chinese, and people have accused him of that. I don't, but that's the accusation. I think that accusation, if it is made against Mr. Nehru, that accusation can be made against Mr. Modi hundredfold, because Mr. Nehru did not spend as much time with Chinese leaders as Mr. Modi has done, and yet this is what has happened.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's difficult. Clearly, the Chinese are playing for high stakes. They see the U.S. In retreat. They're playing a long game. Why they did this at this point of time, a unilateral redefinition of the LAC. There are various theories, and people more competent than me about this have written about it and have spoken about it, and I don't want to add to the cacophony.
Krishna Menon entered India's consciousness in a manner of speaking with his 7 hour, 40-minute long speech at the United Nations spread over 2 days. And that speech was on Kashmir. How much do you think, Jairam, the Modi government's decision on Kashmir, the abrogation of Article 370 last August, how much do you think that could have contributed to this or provoked this?
As I said, I don't want to speculate on Chinese motives, but yes, I mean that was a paradigm shift. It was not just the abrogation of Article 370. It was also the downgradation of Jammu and Kashmir,
Yes.
and separating Ladakh off, from Jammu and Kashmir as a separate duty. So the whole thing, it was a complete paradigm shift. It was not just Article 370. See, Article 370 was very much, people had talked about it as being part of the agenda, the manifesto, of the BJP. But the fact that there was this bifurcation that took place, Ladakh being separated, the state becoming a union territory. I mean, these were unexpected, isn't it?
Yes.
None of us expected it. I mean, I didn't expect it. I certainly, when it happened in Parliament, I thought it would be Article 370. I didn't expect the other two
Yes.
moves to be part of the same legislation. Now, what impact this may have had on the Chinese, people have written, Shiv Shankar Menon has written, Sham Saran has written, Nirupama Rao has written, Gautam Bambawale, Vijay Gokhale. We have a large community of China watchers.
Yeah.
The current foreign minister, although he doesn't speak Chinese, has been ambassador in China for 4 years. He's been a distinguished ambassador. So, there are no shortage of China experts, unlike in 1962,
Yeah.
when the number of people who were China experts in 1962, I would say, the real China expert
Yeah.
was V.V. Paranjpe, maybe
Yeah.
a few others,
Yeah.
So today we have a large number of them, a community of them. Ashok Kanta, I shouldn't forget.
Yes.
And they've all written about this. They've all speculated. Each one has a theory. And, what can you say? I think, we don't know. I mean, there is no clarity as to what they have done, but they've done it.
Yeah.
And the important thing is they've done it. The important thing is that the government is in denial
Yeah.
of what seems to have happened, what has happened, and this everybody is clear on this, that the LAC, as has been understood, has been changed. I must say, all along there have been two interpretations of the LAC. There's been an Indian interpretation and there's been a Chinese interpretation. But that has not allowed that situation has not got destabilized. For
Yeah.
the first time now, the Chinese have unilaterally, I stress the word unilaterally, redefined the LAC. I am one of those who believes that this settlement has to be a negotiated settlement. What was true in 1950, in the late 50s, is true in the early 21st century. Military solution is not a solution.
Yeah.
India has to stand up. It has to be prepared to defend its territory. But the solution to this border dispute has to be a negotiated settlement.
Sure.
And that was recognized by Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee
Yeah.
in 2003.
Yes,
He's recognized by Mr. Modi as well, ever since he became Prime Minister. And Mr. Doval has been meeting his counterpart, on the border.
So let's just change tack a bit. From your book, it emerges that Krishna Menon was, besides everything else, also considered a journalist of somewhat extreme political tendencies by the British intelligence agencies. Which brings us to the nub of this conversation and this podcast. Jairam, how did the media conduct itself? You mentioned this briefly earlier, but how did the media conduct itself before and during the 1962 war? How did it deal with the intrusion and the debacle? Was it compliant? Was it critical? Which newspapers and journalists stood out?
I have to say, having read all the papers of that time, Krishna Prasad, the overwhelming media view was no negotiated settlement. We should not give in. And I think the media perhaps was reflecting the sentiment in Parliament as well. In Parliament, the only people who supported a negotiated settlement were was the Swatantra Party, certain sections of the Swatantra Party, but even the socialists were against a negotiated settlement. There was no mahal for a negotiate. See, the word mahal cannot be translated into English. It's a beautiful word. The mahal was against a negotiated settlement, and the media was reflecting the mahal. The media was not kowtowing to Mr. Nehru. Mr. Nehru was being criticized in newspaper after newspaper. Of course, a large part of the criticism was because of Mr. Menon.
Hmm.
To that extent, Krishna Menon served a very useful purpose. He became the whipping boy, he became the target, he became the punching bag. In fact, when the Chinese invaded on the 20th of October, Rajagopalachari, who was Nehru's bitterest critic, the great Rajaji, issued a statement saying, calling for the resignation of Krishna Menon, but saying the country needs Nehru now more than ever.
Yeah.
Just imagine,
Yeah.
Rajagopalachari, who was attacking Nehru day in and day out from 1959 onwards, gives a statement in the last week of October 1962 saying the country needs Nehru. Nehru must not go. We must strengthen Nehru's hands. But Krishna Menon must go. So, Krishna Menon was fulfilling, the fall guy
Yeah.
type of a. But the media was, it was, as was at that point of time, it was merciless. It was critical of Nehru. And Mr. Nehru didn't avoid the media. He spoke to the media. He gave press conferences. And most importantly, Krishna Prasad, Parliament was in session.
Yes. Yes.
What
We'll
more do
come.
you want? What more do you want when Parliament is in session?
Can you give a specific example of the media at that time? I know in your book, you talk of the Statesman report in particular, preceding the war, of course, but you talk of the Statesman report on General Timaya, but Timaya resigning, unilaterally. But is there any other specific instance that really
Well,
comes to mind?
actually, I've been quite soft uh, on the military icons.
Yeah,
If you read what Timaya was telling the British High Commissioner,
yeah,
Malcolm MacDonald,
yeah,
it's almost treasonous.
yeah,
The way Timaya was talking to a British High Commissioner about his own defense minister. I mean, it's abominable. But I know I've used mild language, and I've let it go because I'm an admirer of Timaya. I've been an admirer of Timaya for long, but Timaya doesn't come out very well. And if any serving army chief, talking like that against his own minister, and it was extraordinary, and he would have been sacked in any other system. And now you look at Major General Chaudhry, who then became general. He became army chief. In November of 1962, he took over from General Thapa. Look at General Chaudhry. For 10 years, he's writing in the Statesman
mm,
uh, in a byline called by a military correspondent.
yes,
And the Statesman of the 1st of September 1959 has this exclusive story on the resignation of Timaya, Admiral Katari, and Air Marshal Mukherjee. And it is written by Chaudhry, a serving army general. And in his autobiography, Chaudhry accepts the fact that he didn't have official permission. Can you imagine these things
yeah,
happening today? I mean, a
yeah,
general talking like this would have been sacked. A general writing like this would have been sacked.
yeah, yeah,
Those were different times. The media, the media. You see, the media was completely anti Krishna Menon. Please remember that.
mm,
And Krishna Menon hated the media. In fact, Krishna Menon was the one who invented the word jute press. You remember the word jute press?
of course,
Uh,
of course,
he he said jute press. He said jute press. This is jute press. And some of the Statesman was still sort of a British type of a colonial newspaper at that point of time. We're talking of the late 50s and early 60s. And you should see the best commentary is not so much the newspapers as Shankar's Weekly.
yeah,
Week out, Shankar, who is very close to Nehru, very, very close to Nehru, very close to Krishna Menon also, but closer to Nehru, lampooning them mercilessly, absolutely merciless.
yeah.
Today, if anybody were to lampoon our Prime Minister in that fashion, my God, there would be sedition charges against the guy.
Yeah.
Uh, and that, but the basic point was that the media, uh, perhaps as I said, reflecting overwhelming sentiment in Parliament, was not in favor of negotiated settlement. That was very clear in the 60s, in the early 60s.
Would the word ambience be a little closer to Mahol, you think?
Ambience doesn't capture Mahol. It doesn't capture Mahol.
No.
It's like the climate of opinion. You
Yeah.
may call it that way. The
Yeah.
climate of opinion was against it. The
Okay.
environment was against it. The ambience was against it. But Mahol is Mahol.
To flip that question, what is the Mahol today which you think the media is reflecting currently in 2020?
Well, this is not nationalism. This is jingoism. And this is it's not. There's no questioning of the media. A guy like Ajay Shukla, is portrayed as anti-national. He's portrayed to be, you know, you look at the way the social media is reacting. Of course, in 1962, you didn't have the social media,
Hmm.
and you didn't even have television at that point of time.
Of course.
I think both social media and television have added to the sense of irresponsibility on national debates. The media should be an instrument of calming, soothing, of bringing temperatures down. But actually, this has just been the reverse.
Mm, mm,
Uh, I have to say this. We have to create a climate of opinion in our country that we have to negotiate a settlement.
mm,
I'm very clear in my mind.
mm,
That is the mahal that has to be created. The Prime
mm,
Minister has to create it, Parliament has to create it, every political party has to create it, the media has to create it.
mm,
If
mm.
India has to be, uh, if India has to occupy its rightful place in the world community, it must negotiate a settlement on the border with China.
Yeah. To go back to what you just said, you speak repeatedly of the media back in 62, by which I presume you're largely talking of English media, right? There was not much
Yeah,
of a
yeah,
Hindi media to talk about.
yeah. It was largely English media. I'm talking of the mainline Indian media. I mean, and of course, a few there were a few magazine publications, but it was largely the English media I'm talking. Yes, I agree with you.
So, in a sense, we could actually argue that this jingoism you see in the media currently is also largely because they're serving to a much larger mass of more impressionable minds.
Yes, I agree. And But I found in 1962, Krishna Prasad,
Hmm,
the media far less subservient to the government than it is today.
hmm, hmm,
Even though the government was headed by a titan like Nehru, it had a huge majority. They were. It was not easy times for them,
hmm.
and of course, and I keep coming back to this point. It's also Parliament. The
Yeah.
media reflects what's happening in Parliament,
Hmm,
and day in and day out. The Mr. Nehru himself and Mr. Krishna Menon certainly were under attack. They were under attack not only by opposition parties, they were under attack even within the Congress party.
yeah.
In fact, on the 7th of November 1962, Krishna Menon's resignation had yet to be accepted. And there was a meeting of something like 430 MPs, both Lok Sabha and Rajya of the Congress party. And Mahavir Tyagi, who was, a member of parliament, very close to Nehru family, got up and said, either you accept Krishna Menon's resignation or you have to go.
Hmm, hmm.
Imagine a member of parliament,
Yeah.
Mahavir Tyagi, telling a man like Jawaharlal Nehru, अगर आपने कृष्ण मेनन का इस्तीफा नहीं लिया और स्वीकारा तो आपको जाना पड़ेगा.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
that
today,
is
of course,
how
Parliament does not meet.
Yeah, and that is how Krishna Menon actually had resigned on the 29th or 30th of October 1962. But his resignation was accepted only on the 7th of November.
Yeah.
And one of the factors was Mahavir Tyagi, Hare Krishna Mahatab, K. Hanumantaya. They were all Hanumantaya, another great figure from another great Kannadiga. These were all people who forced Nehru.
No, now, of course, Parliament does not meet and does not even meet by camera, by not even by video, which is the odd part. But let's come back to journalism. You mentioned Ajay Shukla. Ajay Shukla has said that India has ceded the greatest amount of land to China since 1962. Another journalist, Sushant Singh of the Indian Express, has said that there were major intelligence lapses. Jairam, how do you look at the role of these journalists, both of whom are actually former army men, compared to the pliant role that much of so-called professional media or professional journalists are playing just now?
See, I have differences are inevitable, right? People
Yes.
have different points of view. You can disagree with Ajay, you can disagree with Shushant, but you cannot question their, patriotism. You cannot question their nationalism. You
Hmm.
cannot question their motives.
Yes.
They are arguing on the basis of certain evidence. Now, dispute that evidence, argue that evidence.
Yes.
Come out with the facts, educate the people. And I say, what better way of doing it than in Parliament? Why not an authoritative statement on behalf of the government of India?
Yeah.
Bring out a white paper.
Yeah.
I mean, during, in the 60s, Nehru put all his correspondence with the Chinese in the public domain. Uh, what what prevents the government? Rather than briefing their favorite journalists and their favorite TV channels, the
Yes.
selective leaking that is taking place. Take the country into confidence. This is what has happened, and this is what we require your support for. General Huda has raised questions. General Panag has raised questions. General Malik has raised questions. And, you look at General V.K. Singh, the
Yeah.
way he talks, a man who can call the Indian media prostitutes, you can imagine what frame of mind he is. Serious people have raised questions.
Yes.
Now, I'm willing to listen to the alternative point of view, but you cannot dismiss their concerns, and it's the responsibility of the government to respond to these concerns.
Yeah.
But who will respond? Everybody is a drum beater. General
Yeah.
V.K. Singh is a drum beater. Shankar, an otherwise outstanding professional, has become a drum beater. The National Security Advisor is a drum beater.
Yeah.
So why call Parliament? I would still say call Parliament, make an authoritative statement, take the nation into confidence, and say this is what has happened. Now let's move on.
So let's come back to the media role. In 2020, the media is playing a rather funny, strange role. It lived in denial, as you said, for several weeks till the 20 soldiers were killed. It woke up, it slammed the PM's claim that there were no intruders. And then when this mutual disengagement process began, again the media was upbeat. It said India had ceded territory. But the same media has suddenly gone silent now, especially when it's now been revealed that the Chinese are at least 18 kilometers inside at Depsang. I just want to know if you have any understanding as to what has made this turnaround possible for the media to at one time be in denial, then to criticize, and then now to come back to status quo ante.
I mean, you see, I think that what is happening is uh, there's been a determined effort to control the narrative. That's what it means. It's a single-minded pursuit of not the truth, but a single-minded pursuit of managing the narrative, managing the headlines, and I think that's what we have seen. Now, and occasionally Ajay Shukla speaks, occasionally he writes, occasionally Sushant Singh will write, Panag, Huda. You cannot put everybody down, but you can, discredit them. And you don't discredit them professionally, you discredit them on their personal credentials. This is the worst type of, argumentation that you can think of. So, frankly, the media is no longer independent of the executive. The way the PTI, for example, has been browbeaten, the way they are trying to browbeat the media, the PTI.
Yeah.
PTI is PTI.
Yeah.
They want to take over the PTI. This is not the first time. They've tried to do it in the past, and that has been resisted by the PTI.
Yeah.
So they are trying to make the PTI fall in line. I mean, so the media, I mean, I'm afraid, is no longer an independent voice. It's not as an independent entity. You have people who are speaking, Shiv Shankar Menon is speaking, raised questions. Sham Saran has raised questions. Karan Thapa's interviews, people raise questions.
Yes.
These are voices in the wilderness.
Do you think Mr. Modi will succeed in painting even this loss of lives and loss of territory? Will he succeed in painting this as a victory, and will he succeed in that, do you think? Because of the help of the media?
Certainly, I mean, he's trying to, in this case, certainly he's trying to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Certainly. He has enough cheerleaders, he has enough drum beaters, and whether people are actually convinced or not, I have no evidence. But I know a lot of people who have been his supporters, who are doubtful about the claims that he's making in relation to what has happened on China. You know, I know, many friends of mine. I know many people whom I know who otherwise are his supporters, who say that yes, maybe on China he's not telling the full story. But no, whether that actually is able to write this out, time alone will tell.
Are there anybody within the BJP who are having similar questions and sentiments that maybe we've gone wrong in
I
China?
have not met any. If Parliament was meeting or if standing committees were meeting, I would have had occasion to talk to these members of Parliament from different political parties. Unfortunately, I have not spoken to any on
Yeah.
this. But people have questions. I'm sure people have questions.
Your book on Krishna Menon is built around fantastic material from the archives. Do you think a future historian will have the same luxury of dipping into the past when it comes to 2020? In the sense, are there papers really that the world can trust about how the Modi government went about this whole decision making process?
Well, I'm not sure, Krishna Prasad, because even Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee was not a man to put things on paper, except his own poems. Uh, you know, uh, but Nehru, Krishna Menon belonged to a different generation.
Mm,
Uh,
mm,
the, I mean, for example, I've got a lot of archival material on China, a lot of archival material on the liberation of Goa. They were all put down on paper.
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
because they belong to a different generation.
mm,
I don't think you find many things written down
mm.
on 20. Uh, you know,
So,
I don't know
so
whether the records of the meetings between Xi Jinping and Mr. Modi
yeah,
would ever get declassified. Uh,
yeah,
we have the verbatim record of the meetings between Chau en-lai and Krishna Menon, between Chau en-lai and Nehru, Chau en-lai and Pant, between Mao and Nehru. These have all been declassified.
mm, mm.
But whether these conversations will ever get declassified, I can't say. It should. I am a great believer in the 30-year rule. You know,
Yeah.
uh, all documents should get declassified and should be available for scholarly analysis. And, this is what the British do routinely. And this is what the
Absolutely.
Americans do as well.
Yeah. In an earlier book which you did on Indira Gandhi's secretary P.N. Huxer,
Yeah.
you recount an excellent anecdote about how Mr. Huxer advised the Prime Minister against accepting the Bharat Ratna for her role in the Bangladesh war, and
Absolutely.
and how he himself turned down the Padma Vibhushan when they
Yeah,
tried to buy him
absolutely.
out.
Absolutely. Can you imagine? Can
Yeah.
you imagine? Don't do Notebandi, don't do demonetization. This will be disastrous. I can't imagine Jaishankar telling the Prime Minister,
Yeah.
don't do this, or Amit Shah, or whoever. I mean, those were
Yeah.
different times. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Huxer could tell Indira Gandhi, don't take Bharat Ratna. And he himself refused the Padma Vibhushan. Aksar could tell Indira Gandhi, make up your mind. Do you want to be Prime Minister of India or Sanjay Gandhi's mother?
Mm.
you know? So, I mean, those were different people. Uh, Doval is no Huxer.
Mm.
Jaishankar is no Huxer.
So you do think that, or you do suspect that this could still be a one-man operation, all of it, even the China
Oh,
thing.
of course. I think Shatrughan Sinha had the best description. It's a one-man show, two-man army.
Yeah. Jairam, let me come to the last couple of questions in this main round. You authored another book among all your scholarly works, you authored another book called Making Sense of Chindia.
Yeah.
In fact, you are credited with creating this portmanteau word of India and China as Chindia. Looking at the way things have panned out in the last few weeks, this ban on TikTok and Chinese apps, the cancellation of Chinese contracts, the boycott of Chinese goods, and virtually, India and China are not looking eye to eye. Do you think this rupture between these two large civilizations is forever? And is that a good thing going forward?
Well, I hope it's not forever. We will have our differences. I think we will be in competition. We may also be in confrontation, but I hope we will not have conflict. There will be avenues for cooperation. But most importantly, we have to understand each other. India has to invest far more. I think China has invested far more in understanding India than India has. There are more Chinese journalists in India than Indian journalists in China.
Mm.
I mean, look at it that way. There's one good index, no?
Mm.
I think we need to understand. I mean, we are giant civilizations. We are nuclear powered. We are economic giants. We are neighbors. We have a disputed border. We have to find a way of engaging. But I have to say that what has happened in the last month and a half is deeply disturbing because it shows a different China,
Mm. Mm.
and it will be a long road back to normalcy, if at all.
Mm. Mm.
As far as I'm concerned, we have to restore the status quo, and then we can start talking.
Well, the BJP and RSS have spent an obscene amount of time belittling and deriding Nehru since they came to power. Now that 2020 has happened with these incursions, with these loss of lives and loss of territory, who do you think will come out smelling better after their tiff with China, Nehru or Modi?
No, they'll keep belittling Nehru. They'll keep trying to defame him. They'll keep trying to obliterate his. That's their one-point agenda. That's the one-point RSS agenda. It's the one-point um, Narendra Modi agenda as well. They can live with Indira Gandhi. They can live with Rajiv Gandhi. It's Nehru that they are not able to stomach because Nehru's idea of India is fundamentally different. Vision of India is fundamentally different, than what the RSS stood for and stands for.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, but it's very clear that Nehru, if as I made this point to you earlier, Mr. Modi has spent more time with Chinese leaders than Mr. Nehru ever did, uh, and he's ended up losing more territory than Mr. Nehru did.
Yeah. Well, Jairam, those were the questions I had in mind on China and the media. But before we wrap up this conversation, I have a set of quick questions. And since you were born in Chikmagalur, I suppose you'll understand it if we call this segment Buy Two Coffee. So, you once said that the rate of growth of any economy is inversely proportional to the number of economists. Looking at the number of economists in the Modi ministry, what will India's GDP be next year?
Well, yeah, I mean, the rate of growth is inversely proportional to the number of brilliant economists. India has produced a lot of brilliant economists. Japan hasn't. South Korea hasn't.
Yeah.
Taiwan has. But yeah, I mean, that was a light aside. But one thing I find now, for example, my friend Ratin Roy, who's
Hmm.
director of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, has also decided to quit.
I see.
Raghuram Rajan quit, Arvind Subramaniam quit, Arvind Panagaria quit, Urjit Patel quit, Viral Acharya quit. Now Ratin Roy has quit. It's not good. The system must hold on to people. These are good professionals. They are top flight professionals, and government needs these people. Government needs talent. Any government requires talent. But I'm afraid this government seems to be particularly unsuccessful in holding back the people. And that's because I think these guys feel hemmed in. When they say something that is even moderately critical of the government, they are immediately asked to shut up. I know this happened with Ratin, for example, and I think that professionals like to have a little bit of freedom to say what they want, write what they want, and I think we should be large-hearted enough. I would say that it's sad that good people are not joining this government. This government, like any government, requires lateral entrance. And the lateral entrance must not get sucked in by the system. They must have the freedom to speak. They must have the freedom. The planning commission. I spent long years in government, and the planning commission and the governments of the day were always at loggerheads with each other. I would, as minister for 8 years, I was constantly battling Bhattak Singh Ahluwalia. I had a different point of view. But that was the planning commission. Today, do you have the Niti Aayog giving a different point of view? No. So, the government has become one giant echo chamber.
Yeah. Well, the former ambassador and former planning commission member Abid Hussain called you Jairam Ramesh and said that Jairam has the highest IQ I have ever come across in anybody. What is your one-line high IQ diagnosis of the Modi regime? What is its biggest problem?
I think you're misquoting Abid Hussain.
No,
if I remember right, he didn't say maximum IQ. He said maximum HP, maximum horsepower. He didn't use the word IQ. He used the word HP, horsepower.
Okay. So what is your high horsepower diagnosis of the Modi regime?
Well, look, they had a clear mandate in 2014. And they had an even clearer mandate in 2019. Now, but even pre-COVID, I can understand in the last three and a half months, the COVID crisis has been an extraordinary crisis. But even pre-COVID, I'm afraid, the mandate was used not for strengthening the economy, not for strengthening the democratic foundations. Demonetization was a big shock. The way GST got implemented was also a big shock. And then, we had these extraordinary powers given to tax officials, tax terrorism. So the economy was in a free fall even before COVID. You had 6 consecutive quarters of declining GDP growth. And see, the main thing is Prime Minister doesn't take Parliament seriously at all. He rarely sits in Parliament. I can understand in the last 3 months, Parliament is maybe extenuating circumstances for that. But even otherwise, Parliament has lost its value as a forum for debate. Government will always have its way, but parliaments must have their say, no?
Yeah.
I think that's India is really becoming an illiberal democracy. Farid Zakaria wrote many years ago, that there are liberal democracies and there are illiberal democracies. And I think we are now becoming, we have all the external trappings of democracy: political parties, parliament, Vidhan Sabha, MLA, election, all the external trappings of a democracy we have. But the soul of a democracy, is vanished. I mean, it's just being completely, silenced. Who's a very distinguished Hindi journalist. He wrote a column some years ago in Dainik Bhaskar. And I still remember a line that he used, which summarizes, what has happened in the last 6 years. And he said, लोकतंत्र की सेनाएं बंद हो रही है और एक तंत्र का तोप चल रहा है. Beautiful, no?
Beautiful.
लोकतंत्र की सेनाएं बंद हो रहा है और एक तंत्र का तोप चल रहा है. I still remember this. I think it's a very succinct and pithy description of what has happened since 2014.
Well, you also came up with a very pithy and succinct description of Narendra Modi when you called him the Jagat Guru of Jhoot. You of course, you of course said it in the context of this government's claim that it had announced an economic package which was only just 10% of the GDP, etc. But Jairam, why do you think there is such a market for lies and myths and untruths in this modern India under Mr. Modi?
I find it truly extraordinary, and I've said this in Parliament that Pradhan Mantri galti se bhi sach nahi bolenge. It's truly extraordinary that, his ability with a straight face, to embroider. I mean, everybody in politics, occasionally takes liberties with truth.
Yeah.
Everybody in politics takes liberties with truth.
Yeah.
But, this is too much for a prime minister, and he doesn't need to. The mandate that he got in 2014, the mandate that he got in 2019, he could have risen above his own insecurities. But unfortunately, he takes delight in not speaking the truth. What can I say? Asatyameva jayate.
So for the first time in 70 years, you have a man whom you can subject to the truth detector test. That's what you're saying.
Absolutely not lie detector test. We should subject him to a very good one. True. Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
It was once said, Henry Kissinger had a deputy called Helmut Sonnenfeld.
Yeah.
And Sonnenfeld, somebody asked Sonnenfeld, why does Henry Kissinger always embroider facts? And Sonnenfeld said, you see, Kissinger does not lie because it is in interest. It is in his interest. Kissinger lies because it is in his nature.
Super. Well, Jairam, in the UPA cabinet of 2009, there were 12 ministers who had studied in England and America. And 8 of them, as you put it elsewhere, had crossed the Atlantic. By that yardstick, how does this government look? The literacy of this government.
I don't, that I said it lightly. But it doesn't matter, Krishna Prasad. It doesn't matter, where you study. I mean, just 2 days ago, India lost one of its greatest mathematicians, C.S. Sheshadri. Yeah. Sheshadri never studied abroad. He studied in Bombay, he worked all his life in Chennai. No, I am not, I don't believe that, foreign education or Harvard education, or MIT education equips you with anything extra. No. I am not. But people who lie about their educational qualifications, people who go to Yale for 1 week lecture course and say that they are graduates of Yale.
Yeah.
People who claim to have degrees in a course called entire political science, which nobody knows exists.
Yeah.
I mean, my problem is that. My problem is, it doesn't matter where you studied, what you study, Kamaraj. My God, let's take the example of Kamaraj, one of the greatest Indian political leaders, one of the most outstanding chief ministers, the maker of modern Tamil Nadu. Kamaraj was not even matriculate,
Yeah.
6th standard or 7th standard.
Yeah.
So for me, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter really.
Yeah. No, that's fair. In 2012, you said that if Uttar Pradesh becomes open defecation free in 10 years, I can accept that Sai Baba is alive. On,
Well,
Oc- on
I can't
October 2,
take it.
one sec, on October 2 last year, Narendra Modi said India was open defecation free. So is Sai Baba alive?
I would say bullshit. That's all I can say.
Okay.
Uh,
And finally,
say that,
Jairam,
to say that UP is open defecation free,
uh,
is impossible to believe.
okay. And finally, Jairam, your North Block office was famous for playing music all day. And your interests range from Kumar Gandharv to Miles Davis. So let me ask you, as a music fan, as a music buff, what three pieces of music would you recommend to us to elevate this COVID mood?
Well, that's a very difficult question. And yeah, I mean, my interests in music are eclectic. They are Hindustani music, Carnatic music, jazz, and Western classical. Um, to deal with COVID, I wouldn't, offhand, I can't think of any particular piece which would put you in a mood to deal with the crisis. So I'll pass on that.
Okay, three pieces of music, or one piece of music you will recommend to get over the lies of this government.
To get over the
Lies of this government.
no, I think it will require more than music.
Okay, well, that was Jairam Ramesh, former Union Minister, Congress MP, author, columnist, TV anchor, quizzer, and most importantly, the IITian who famously declined his college mate Nandan Nilekani's invitation to invest in Infosys when it was going public and has lived to regret it since. Thank you very much, Jairam, for taking part in this podcast. You have elevated its intelligence quotient and horsepower by a factor that India's economy actually requires. And thank you very much for listening in. Thank you very much, Jairam.
Thank you, Krishna Prasad. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
सवाल उठता है चाइना आकर के हमारे दरवाजे पर दस्तक दे दे और मैं हैरान हूं जी चाइना तो हिंदुस्तान की धरती पर से अपनी फौज को वापस ले जाए लेकिन ये नहीं समझ पा रहा हूं कि हिंदुस्तान की सेना हिंदुस्तान की धरती से अपनी सेना को क्यों हटा रही है दिल्ली की सरकार जवाब नहीं दिया सिंपल सा सवाल है कि चाइना हिंदुस्तान में घुस के आया वापस गया ठीक बात है लेकिन क्या कारण है हमारी धरती पर से हम भी पीछे गए और तब जाकर के सामान्य मानव के मन में सवाल खड़े होते हैं कितनी बेइज्जती मेरे देश की हो रही है भाइयों
Jairam Ramesh's book, A Chequered Brilliance, The Many Lives of V.K. Krishna Menon, is published by Penguin Viking. You can follow Jairam Ramesh on Twitter at Jairam_Ramesh. The theme music for J-Pod was composed by me, Krishna Prasad, using GarageBand. And many thanks to the radio and TV anchor Vasanthi Hariprakash for her support to the Net Paper. Thank you very much for listening in.